Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Mulder, and I'm the pastor of Restored Church and also the stated clerk of Classis, Hudson. And James Lee asked me to do a short 2-minute devotional today for you. And so I'm going to read you a passage that I've been reflecting on from Matthew chapter 26. This is when Jesus is sitting with his disciples and he's celebrating the Passover meal with them on the night before he was going to be betrayed and ultimately his death the next day. And so there's something specific I want us to think about, but let me read to us from Matthew 26, verse 20. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" And he answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" And he said to him, "You have said so." I celebrate communion with our church once a month. And I regularly read the passage of Scripture where Jesus institutes communion for his disciples and tells them what the communion or the Lord's Supper is going to mean. But when I read it, I almost always skip over the parts about Judas. And so as I began rethinking the Lord's Supper and communion, particularly during this time when we're separated from one another and we're getting ready to celebrate Good Friday and Easter services, it occurred to me that you really can't have Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper without Judas. He's prominently featured in every account of this meal. And I thought, what does that mean? What can we take from that? Well, what the disciples took from it was great sorrow. When Jesus sat down with all of them around the table, they all would have dipped their bread in the common bowl in front of them. And so when Jesus said that one of you has dipped his hand in the bowl with me will be my betrayer, that could have been any one of the disciples. And they were filled with great sorrow. Not only because they didn't know at that point if it was them, except for Judas, who did know, but the other 11 didn't know whether he was talking about them, and maybe there was something about themselves that they didn't even know at that point. But even if it wasn't them, it meant that Jesus was going to be betrayed, and relatively soon, and it caused them great sorrow. And so as I thought about what that means for us, it made me realize when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper and when he institutes communion, he does so in the midst of sorrow. And maybe more than anything else today, that's what we need to just acknowledge and admit, that many of us are living in a moment of sorrow. We're living in sadness. We're living in a time of lament. We're living in days that feel dark and heavy. But here's the promise of Good Friday and Easter, that even though we sit in a moment of sorrow, even though we sit in a moment of darkness, we know that the resurrection is right around the corner. And there's something about this passage that reminds me, and I think needs to remind us, that even though we sit in sorrow today, the only way that we get to the feast that Jesus promises is if we sit in the sorrow and wait for the resurrection. I hope that was meaningful for you, something to consider. I hope you have a great Good Friday and a blessed Easter.